For making me so welcome here at the university. This is a great honour for me. It's such a distinguished institution. So thank you to Professor Seong and to Melissa and to Hakyum for making this possible today. As you heard, I'll try to speak for about 40 minutes. If I go slightly under or slightly over, please forgive me. That's because I prefer not to give formal speeches. I prefer to speak slightly from notes, but with plenty of space for me to freelance and to scope a little bit beyond my prepared remarks. So I never know quite how long I'm going to speak for or where I'm going to land with my remarks. I'm going to be heading straight to the airport after this, which is a shame because as I look out there, I see what a gorgeous day this is, and I would love to explore this campus a bit more. It's really it looks a beautiful place, and I love this city. This is only my second visit to Seoul, but I've spent some time exploring the city, and I really appreciate it. And like many Western audiences these days, I'm a new convert to Korean culture, which has become much more prominent internationally, of course. And a couple of weeks ago, your embassy in Canberra invited me to a film festival, a Korean film festival, and to a screening of a film called Ode to My Father. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that name by the English name, but you may remember the film. I think it's about 10 years old now, about one man's story and really the story of modern Korea from the war onwards. And I'll only say I was glad the theatre was dark so no one saw me cry, because it is a very emotional film. And I'm struck by, as I've been here over the last few days, by the number of parallels and the echoes that I hear of Australian foreign policy and national security debates. And I hope I'll try to get into that a little bit over the next 30 or 40 minutes. The common denominator, of course, being Donald Trump, which we're all so concerned about. I'll try not to let Mr. Trump consume our entire conversation because that's so easy to do. But nevertheless, that is an important factor. I should say a little bit about the Lowy Institute, which is an independent and non-partisan think tank in Australia. It is now about 22 years old. I've been there for most of that time, about 17 years. As you heard, I was the founding editor of The Interpreter, which is a magazine that I would encourage you all to take a look at. You'll find it, a simple Google search will take you there. Everything that the Lowy Institute produces, including The Interpreter, is available for free, and there are no paywalls. And you can quote us as freely as you like, as long as you acknowledge the source of your comments. And also, by the way, can I interest you, particularly as you are graduate students, in perhaps contributing to The Interpreter? I mean, you are now at a stage in your careers where all of you, if you aren't already, should be thinking seriously about how you contribute to public conversation around the region and around the world. And the Interpreter is a wonderful platform for doing so. We now have a truly global audience, and I would say particularly a small but very powerful and influential audience in Washington. For instance, the Asia watching community in Washington, they all know about The Interpreter. Some of them write for it, so you can be writing for it too. So you can pitch your ideas to me or our managing editor as well. You'll find all the details on the website, or I'm happy to take your inquiries personally if you'd like to email me. So I would encourage you all to make your pitches. So I want to talk about an Australian perspective, which is what you heard, what you can read there, Australian perspective on the Asian strategic balance. But I think I need to lay the groundwork a little bit by talking about my own perspective on that strategic balance. And essentially, I want to talk about US and China. Of course, this is a multi-layered field, and we can't reduce everything to the bilateral contest. But nevertheless, I'm going to reduce it to the bilateral contest. because I think it's by far the most important factor for us in Australia, but also for you here in Korea. Yeah. So there are no, beginning with China, there are no major debates, no major questions about the basic facts of China's rise. It is already, by some measures, the biggest economy in the world, maybe the second biggest, depending on how you measure it, but certainly an economic power of a scale that hasn't risen in the world for well over a century. The economist Adam Tooze recently referred to China's emergence, particularly as an industrial power, as representing the material dethroning of the West. I don't think that's an exaggeration. So this is a massive economic phenomenon. And of course, you like me to use that? A massive economic phenomenon. And that, of course, comes with strategic and military and strategic consequences as well. It was certainly the preference of the United States for many, many years that China would emerge as an economic powerhouse without affecting the strategic balance in Asia. But that is clearly not going to happen. So to me, the subtext of phrases that were invented by American officials in the late 1990s, I think, such as responsible stakeholder, those phrases were intended, I think, to suggest the idea that the United States was incredibly comfortable, in fact, encouraged China's economic development because it brought many benefits to the United States, but that economic development should not come with any strategic rebalancing. So the United States wanted China to be an economic elephant, but a strategic mouse. Or if you'd like to think of it differently, the United States would have preferred a future in which China was something like post-war West Germany or post-war Japan, where it was an economic powerhouse, but it remained strategically subordinate to the United States. But of course, West Germany and Japan were exceptions. They were not the rule. And typically when a nation rises, or when it re-emerges, in China's case, as a global economic power, that comes with global strategic power as well. And in fact, anything less would be surprising. I think what we can expect is that China has an ambition to become, if not certainly the leading strategic power in Asia, but perhaps the dominant strategic power in Asia as well. And of course, that means that it will have to displace the United States and ultimately to attempt to push the United States out of Asia altogether. Whether that's going to happen is something we'll discuss a little bit further, but for the moment, I think it's perfectly plausible to imagine that is at least China's ambition. And just to illustrate why this is plausible, in fact, even natural, it's worth considering a counterfactual situation. So what if the tables were turned? What if instead of the United States having, 70 to 80,000 troops in Asia and an aircraft carrier permanently stationed in Japan, plus other various bases and facilities, what if it was the other way around? What if China had 80,000 troops stationed in Canada? What if China had an aircraft carrier stationed in Cuba? We would expect the United States, as a powerful nation, which wants to establish its place as the leading power in its own region, we would expect the United States to push back against such an arrangement. Now, of course, for many decades, China didn't have the power to do anything about America's presence in Asia, but now it does. And so it is, to me, almost natural, although I resist the term, I'm hesitant to use that term, but it is certainly almost natural for China to be pushing back against the preponderance of American power in our region and to establish leadership of its own. And of course, we already see a great deal of evidence for China wanting to establish itself as a leading military power. So just, I think the week before last, I published a piece in Foreign Policy magazine, foreignpolicy.com, that was based on my observations of the Chinese military parade. The argument I made there is that it is no longer enough to think about Chinese military power and Chinese military technology as following or imitating the leading edge around the world. China is now an innovator and a leader in military technology. This, to me, is an inescapable conclusion when I examine the evidence. I used to work in the Australian intelligence community. I now work in a think tank. And throughout my career in both of those fields, I have followed and watched closely Chinese military technological development. And to me, there's no question that China is developing world-leading military technologies now, and on a scale that will ultimately outrank the United States. China, I don't think, has ambitions to be a global military power in the way that the US is, but it does have ambitions to be the leading regional military power. And it has made enormous strides in that regard. The argument I made in foreign policy is that the main focus of Chinese effort in the military sphere is in its near abroad, the first and second island chains, if you like, and that it has fewer ambitions, or at least less urgent ambitions beyond that. So back in late January this year, we saw a flotilla of Chinese warships sail around Australia. But that's still a fairly rare event. And China has some experience at deploying its military forces far from home. It's been conducting anti-piracy missions off the west coast, the east coast of Africa for, a decade and a half now. But China hasn't expanded its overseas basing capability, still only has one base in Djibouti. And there's no evidence of a second one on the way. And it is investing in long-range military capabilities, but really without foreign basing, the effect you can have at very long distances is severely limited, the military effect that you can have. So my argument in the foreign policy piece is that China is still very much focused on Taiwan, I think, first and foremost, on developing the capability to retake Taiwan if it needs to, but also on developing its capabilities to essentially exclude the United States from the first and then the second island chain. The United States and its allies, I should stress. So that is my little summary of where China's growing place in the region and its desire to ultimately displace the United States as the leading power in Asia. So what about the United States on the other hand? At the moment, we see a debate in the United States between two schools of thought within the administration, one called the restraint school and the other the prioritizer school. The prioritizer school is said to be to argue that the United States is overcommitted in Europe and the Middle East and needs to prioritize China and the Asia Pacific. The other school is the so-called restrainers, and those people argue that actually the United States doesn't have any vital security interests in Asia either. Its security focus ought to be on the Western Hemisphere, on North and South America, and it certainly wants to engage in economic competition with China, but not in strategic competition with China. It is still extremely unclear which of those two schools is in the ascendancy within the Trump administration. Some people say that Trump himself is in the restraint school, but it's very hard to know. I'm not sure he himself knows. I think what we can say, though, we may learn more about this, by the way, in the coming weeks when the National Defence Strategy is released and the National Security Strategy. But I think really what we need to do is look beyond the Trump administration for guidance about the future of American power. And just excuse me while I take a sip of water. So as I hinted at in my introduction, I don't think we should put the Trump administration at the absolute centre of our thinking about the future of American power. Trump, I regard as an accelerant of existing trends in American power, but not a kind of revolution or a major shift away from existing trends in American foreign and security policy. Let me try to justify that claim. And I'll start here in 1991. In 1991, the end of the Cold War, of course, but also the year that the United States, in a dramatic feat of military technology and military strategy, pushed Iraqi forces out of Kuwait at almost no cost to themselves, an overwhelming defeat for the Iraqi forces. And that military victory is seen by most analysts as marking the beginning of China's own modernization push. The People's Liberation Army witnessed that feat of arms, the United States, and said, gosh, we have nothing like that kind of capability. Our forces are probably weaker than the Iraqi forces. So we need to modernize and modernize quickly. And of course, in 1996, China got another shock when the United States sailed a carrier battle group through the Taiwan Strait, knowing that China had very little or no capability to actually stop them from doing that. So those two events together really were the trigger for the Chinese military modernization drive that continues to this day. Now, the reason I mention 1991 and the beginning of that modernization process is because it's important to look at what the United States has done in response to China's military modernization since then. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it is the most dramatic modernization of any military force that we have seen in the world since the Second World War. And what did the United States do in response? Actually, not that much. So if you look at the order of battle that the United States Pacific Fleet could boast in 1991, and you compare it to the same order of battle today, it looks roughly the same. It's more modern, of course. The older weapon systems have been replaced by new ones. But in sheer numbers, the number of troops that are deployed here in Asia, it's roughly the same figure. It's, I think, slightly more these days than it was in 1991, but no significant change. Nothing like the kind of change that you would expect to see if the United States was actually preparing to counter the enormous growth of Chinese military power in the region. The other thing that I point to is that there is a lack of evidence for political commitment from the United States to countering the growth of Chinese power in Asia. So in 1947, President Truman faced the US Congress and a national radio audience and declared that the policy of the United States would be to contain Soviet communist power around the world. This was the doctrine of containment that was announced by Truman in 1947. No US president has done anything close to that in the modern era. So we're told routinely that the United States is now engaged on a second Cold War with China. Well, you would think if the Cold War was really on, that the US president would face the American public to say, well, this is now the defining challenge of our time. But nothing like that has happened. So the United States does use that kind of language in its policy documents, and US presidents do talk that way when they come to Asia, but they don't face their own people this way. They don't say to the American public, this is now the government and the American nation's leading challenge, as the Cold War was. Because the Cold War, don't forget, was a whole of nation effort. It wasn't just military, it was the intelligence, foreign policy, science, education, the arts, American popular culture became consumed by the Cold War. I don't see any evidence of an equivalent push by the US government, and I don't see any evidence that China consumes the American culture in the way that Soviet communism did in the 1940s and the 1950s. Economics is another factor here. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership was abandoned by the United States before it was even started. So there's no major economic initiative by the US in Asia either. And then finally, I would just point out, just to go back to the military point, I've heard some people argue in the United States. In fact, the conference I attended at CAIDA just a couple of days ago, there was an American delegate on my panel who made this exact point. I said, there's no evidence that the United States is ramping up its military effort in the region. And his response was essentially, well, just wait, we're getting there. We may be late, but we're going to get there eventually. And my response to that point is, well, maybe you're right. Maybe the United States will find the resolve to lift its military effort in Asia in a way that's necessary to counter the growth of Chinese military power. But then there are two problems that arise from that. One is, who is going to host all these forces in the region? If America wants to double the size of its fleet, Pacific fleet, where are they going to go? Which Asian country is prepared to host that many more American troops? And then the second problem that arises is, I think if a dramatic ramping up of American forces was going to happen, China would respond. And if China responded, we would then be at the beginnings of an arms race. I don't think we currently have an arms race in Asia. But if we were to have an arms race in Asia, I think China is in much better position to win than the United States is. China has the industrial power now to compete, I think, very successfully in an arms race. And also, it doesn't spend as much as the US. As a percentage of GDP, the United States spends about 3.5%. China spends, well, it depends on who you ask. There are different experts have different views, but the American analyst Taylor Fravel, who I would rely on, I think is a very reliable analyst on this question, he estimates that it's a little over 2%, maybe approaching 2.5% of GDP. So China has a much higher ceiling. It can still spend a lot more of its GDP on defense without doing major damage to its economy. So, and then finally, I would just say, I wonder if it's in the interests of any of our countries here in the region for the United States to respond quite so dramatically to China's military buildup. We definitely want the United States to remain an influential presence in this region. But if the United States is going to be a power that demands the maintenance of US primacy, or actually I would say the restoration of US primacy because it's already eroded, well then I think we are embarked on a path that leads only to confrontation. For the reasons I said earlier, China is not going to be content to be a subordinate strategic power in Asia to the United States. So if the United States is intent on maintaining its leadership, its primacy, then I think we are on a path to confrontation. On the other hand, if the United States is content for a less ambitious position in the region, a more modest role of a balancer, then I think we have a better chance of a long-term peace between China and the United States, a stable modus vivendi between those two powers. I do think, however, that if the United States is content to have a much more modest role of that kind, then it will have to ask itself some very serious questions about the status of Taiwan. I don't think it's possible to be a balancing power in the region, but to also insist on the defense of Taiwan. I think the United States is going to have to give some ground on that question. So just with the little bit of time that I have remaining, I won't speak for too much longer. I want to say a few things about Australia's place in all of this. Actually, by the way, before I do that, a few more remarks just about the US. It's often said American strategic documents do this routinely, and it's said by American experts as well, that the United States cannot be secure unless Asia is secure. I'm not sure that's true. So I think ultimately we have to doubt American resolve to defend its position in Asia. The American analyst Rush Doshi, who served in the Biden administration, pointed out in a book he wrote a few years ago that the United States has never faced an adversary or a group of adversaries with more than 60% of American GDP. And yet China passed that mark more than 10 years ago. So China is by far the biggest adversary that the United States has ever faced. Now, to engage in a contest with an adversary of that size, a contest that could potentially lead to a catastrophic war, you need to have an excellent reason. You need to have an existential reason. And I would argue that the United States doesn't have that reason, ultimately. So, as I said, the United States will routinely claim that the security of Asia is a vital interest for the United States. But that's a far easier claim to make if you're not running very high risks. If you are running very high risks against a powerful opponent, you need to ask yourself much deeper questions. How important is this? How important is it for us to maintain our leadership in Asia? And if it's not vital, if it's not absolutely critical for your national survival, then you probably won't do it. And that is, I think, the dilemma that we in Australia and you in Korea also face. Just how vital is the security of us as allies to the United States? And if it's not important enough to make major sacrifices, then I think we have to face up to the fact that we need to do much more for ourselves. In fact, I don't think this point is better illustrated than by looking at South Korea, and I would welcome your feedback on this. This is an outsider's perspective. It seems to me the development of South Korea's independent strategic capabilities, not with nuclear weapons, but certainly coming as close to developing nuclear weapons without actually doing so, strategic weapon systems including submarine-launched ballistic missiles. That to me is an indicator that South Korea implicitly recognises the erosion of the credibility of American extended deterrence. And that to me is quite a natural development, because ultimately what I think, and again this is implicit, no South Korean leader would say this publicly, I'm sure, but it seems to me what South Korea has quite rightly recognised is that they have been asking too much of the United States, particularly since North Korea developed capabilities to strike the continental United States with intercontinental ballistic missiles. At that point, what South Korea was effectively asking the United States to do was to sacrifice potentially one of its cities in order to defend South Korea. Now, that is not a fair thing to ask of any ally. That is much too big a sacrifice. And so I think South Korea, quite rightly, has internalised this idea and said, well, we can't ask the Americans to make this kind of sacrifice. We have to do it ourselves. Now, turning to Australia, I think that realisation has not yet been internalised in Australia. There is still a very strong sense in my own country that the future lies in tying ourselves much more closely to the United States than in developing self-reliant, independent capabilities within the alliance structure. Right? So certainly nobody in Australia is arguing that for an end to the alliance, But there are many of us, and I'm one of them, who has argued very strongly that we should seek a more self-reliant defence and foreign policy and a more independent foreign policy within the alliance. And that was perfectly possible in years past, because Australia did move down that road starting in the 1980s. But since then, we've moved back towards a closer relationship with the United States. It started around after 9/11, when our Prime Minister at the time invoked the alliance with the United States after 9/11, which is the first time that's ever happened in its history. And we sent troops to Afghanistan and then subsequently to Iraq to help the American war on terrorism. But really, there was another movement in the early 2010s when, in 2011, President Obama came to Australia and announced the pivot, or sometimes referred to as the rebalance. And that was done in Australia, and at the same time, the US and Australia announced that we were going to host US Marines in Northern Australia for training purposes. But I would argue that the single biggest change to the Australia-US alliance in its history came in 2021, September 2021, when we announced AUKUS. And I'm sure some of you will be familiar with that term. So just very briefly, the AUKUS is a tripartite initiative between the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia, a security agreement at the centre of which is the supply of nuclear-powered submarines to the Australian Navy. The proposal is for Australia to get 8 nuclear-powered submarines. 3 and maybe 5 of them will come from the US, and then 3 and maybe as many as 5 of them will be a new design that is primarily comes from the United Kingdom, but will also be built in Australia. This is a hugely ambitious initiative for Australia. I would argue far in excess of what Australia can successfully achieve, but nevertheless, the government remains confident that Australia, with its allies together, can actually make this agreement come to pass. Now, I would say at a strategic level, it seems to me impossible to imagine AUKUS unless the Australian government is very confident that the United States will remain the leading strategic power in Asia, right? So I think at the heart of this agreement, although superficially you could see it purely as an arms sale agreement, it is in fact a much deeper strategic alignment, because you would not enter into an agreement of this sort unless you felt very confident that the United States is going to remain the leading power in Asia. Now that seems to me as a very bad bet, but successive governments have decided otherwise. I think the other danger of AUKUS, as far as, in my view, is that it ties Australia much too closely to American strategic objectives. So weapons technology of this kind has, weapons of any kind are designed to be instruments of policy, but weapons like these can actually drive policy. So I would argue if Australia has these weapons, these nuclear-powered submarines in its navy, then it's going to be impossible for us to not use them. If there's a war between the US and China and the Americans come to us and say, okay, we supplied you with these submarines, now we'd like you to use them, please. We'd like you to help us to defend Taiwan. At that point, it seems to me almost impossible politically for Australia to say, no, sorry, we won't do it. So in formal terms, in abstract terms, we maintain sovereignty of these submarines, but in real political terms, they are not sovereign because they are very much tied to American strategic objectives in Asia. Nevertheless, just in closing, I would say just to describe the Australian strategic debate, there's a very strong consensus across our two major political parties about AUKUS. It was conceived and announced by a centre-right government, and it has been embraced and continued by a centre-left government that we have in office now. There is no prospect of that consensus breaking. There is dissent in Australia, including people like me who are relatively prominent in the debate, but who are not having any influence on our politics. So the politics is still very much in favour of AUKUS and of a much tighter and stronger alliance between the US and Australia. I note here, and I'll finish on this point, that President Lee made some remarks last weekend on Facebook, and this is the translation that I saw. What is important is to reject the submissive mindset that national self-reliant defence is impossible without foreign troops. That is not a sentiment that you would ever hear an Australian Prime Minister make right now. So I'll stop there, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.